Hello guys, today is early morning and a little bit different format of video, but we will still talk about Salesforce. So today I would like to discuss with you a thing related to development, like for example how we need to start our work on the project, because sometimes when I was able to be involved into the, let's say, meat of the project or at the end of the project, I was able to see that from the beginning, right, let's say, technique of development was not selected, and that's why on the project there was different kind of issues that it was necessary to resolve. So how we could avoid those kind of issues if we will start just from the beginning. So when we just start in development of our project, so one of maybe good stuff, it's always to have a technical leader on that project who will control general, let's say, development architecture. So why it's so important? Because when we start in a project, we need to define what kind of, for example, automation tools we will use. Because if we will use Apex triggers, if we will use flows, if we will use other kind of stuff, so the thing that it will be at the end, it will be hard for us to actually control the order of execution of this different stuff. Let's say when one logic will be completed prior to another, and for us to avoid situation when we will have race conditions in different kind of between our logic, so it will be great to define it from the very beginning of the project. Let's say what is the automation tool and what is connectivity between them. Let's say if you decided to use flows for everything, but for flows at this moment in Salesforce we have let's say such kind of issue when they are working with more than 2000 of records in a synchronous manner. We could see that they are hitting CPU limits. So that means that if we will be able to see things like this, so what we need to do is we need to actually convert them into epics, and as you could see it will be then duplicated effort. So if you first of all developed in flow, then it passed testing on the low amount of data, so then it will be promoted to the let's say QA or UAT environment, and then you will just realize that it needs to be replaced with epics. So it will impact your schedule. You will need to rework, and like it's not something that you really need. But flows have their own, let's say, advantages. You don't need to support, let's say, unit testing, right? And write it just to release your code. But I was able to see that at this moment we could enable functionality where we could even run tests for flows. But anyway, here we are more about the topic that we need to think about what kind of automation tools we will use on the project from the beginning, and if we will have a technical leader on the project who will be able to control that every new developer not starting like to develop with their own way, but will follow some specified pattern for the project, so it will be very beneficial at the end. So next topic that we need to consider when we start in development, and it will be good if you will have architect on the project, that is amount of data that we will need to work with. Because sometimes we could think about our logic, and our logic could be optimized to work with just a small amount of data, and in that case we will run all logic synchronously. We will not use batches, we will not use queuable feature functions and all this stuff and asynchronous flows, because we will think that it will be enough for us it's just to proceed the records like this. But sometimes on the project what is happening is that if, for example, in the very beginning guys could see that, for example, it's very simple logic, like for example we need to do something with related contact to accounts, and they are doing so, but then they realizing that like on the top level environments where the tons of data, it's actually failing, because maybe under one account there are more than 50,000 of records, and that's why it's failing. So they now need to rework their logic and for it to work in a synchronous manner. And even in that case they will need to think about the pattern, right? How they could apply asynchronous logic with synchronous, when one of them needs to be used and when another one, let's say, to have some kind of factor, right? For example, configurable factor, which you could store in custom metadata, and based on this factor you will be able to control like based on what amount of contacts related to account you need to run asynchronous logic and when you need to run synchronous logic. So again, if it will be just found on the top level environments, again it's rework, again it's impact on the schedule, and like it's something not what we usually want to have. So that's why amount of data that we need to consider, it's also very good and very key points that we need to include into our consideration. So next considerations that we need to think of when we just start in a project, it's how it will be better to name it. Let me just think. So it's the way how we will structure our code. Let's say if you decided to use not just, let's say, low code project implementation, but we also decided, or like it's important for us to use Apex to proceed with some heavy operations, right? Or like with even basic logic. It's depends on what was selected for the actual project. So that means that we need to structure our code and organize it in such kind of manner where everything will be understandable, when all classes will take their responsibility, will do what is necessary. So for that, what I'm usually recommend is to follow solid pattern, and in that case, at least based on those recommendations, we will be able to structure our code in a good manner. So one of key stuff that I could advise at this moment is when we, for example, planning our interaction with the database in Salesforce, we mostly have two basic operations. It's operation when we actually insert into the database and we actually retrieve some data from the database. So for both of these situations, what we need to do in Salesforce is we need to consider some kind of security, we need to consider sharing rules, we need to consider user access to the fields and all other stuff. So to do so, what we could think of is we could create DAO classes. So let me provide you an example. So let's imagine that in our project we are working a lot with contacts, and we have a different classes that are working with this object, and we would like to organize that code somehow. Then what we could do, we could create DAO class. So this class will provide us access to the database for this specific object, and in addition to the class, what we could implement for that class is we could actually implement singleton pattern. So that means that during our transaction, only one instance of the class will be created, and if from somewhere from our code we will invoke it one more time, so it will already return to us the same instance that we already created. So in that case, what will happen is we will have only one class which is responsible for any kind of SOQL queries to our object. It will contain only one instance per transaction, and if in the future we will, let's say, introduce a new field, so we will not need to go through 1 tons of files, take a look and find all of the places where we need to add that field, or vice versa when we need to delete that field. So in that case, what we will be able to do is we will be able to just open one file and modify the queries where we need it. Of course, there could be applied different techniques that we could add, like for example usage of a list of fields that are actually available for that object, right, and control it via list in that class. But you still see that my point here is in difference, that we will be able to have only one place where we will need to do an adjustment, and it's something from the solid, right, where there should be no many changes in different classes if you just need to update something for only one reason. So in terms of DAO classes, right, what is else useful, because we just discussed the part where we need to have access to database, right, to grab the records. So when we are grabbing the records, then when we have DAO classes, it's easier for us to actually connect those DAO classes with, for example, some SOQL builder. So the reason why we could potentially need to use SOQL builder, it's situation when we need to enforce security. And with the SockQL Builder, what is possible for us to implement is, for example, implement into SockQL queries keyword with security enforced, right? For example, into SockQL query. But in that case, we need to be careful because the way how it's work at this moment, it will just fail our code if we don't have access to some certain field without, like really understandable exception. So in that case, at this moment, we have a little bit different technique. It's using stripping accessible fields, and as a part of that functionality, what is possible for us to use as well, it's we could actually grab the list of fields that current user don't have access to, and for example put them into some logger object. And in that case, we will be able to track for what exactly profiles we have some missed access, and then we will be able to correct it during, like to launch of that project. So you see, so at this moment we just discussed that with that technique, with our classes plus SockQL Builder, we are getting a situation when we could enforce our security, especially when we will need to pass App Exchange security review or any other kind of security review. So one more topic that I just touched, right, is related to database, and we just discussed a situation when we need to grab data from Salesforce database, but here at the same period of time, because we discussed it, that part that code needs to be organized, so we need to think about how our actual business logic will be organized on the code level. So that means that we need to have, for example, processor classes where we will store the actual, let's say, business logic. We could have some kind of basic classes that will provide basic functionality, like for example utility classes. So that means that in the utility classes we will be able to store some logic which is actually not perform any kind of business logic, like for example converting list to a map, or for example do some pretty simple concatenation of the string, right? So it's actually not doing any kind of business logic, it just perform very basic operations in terms of the logic. So that's why what we could use is we could use utility classes or helper classes where we will store that kind of logic. And in that case, the code that we will have in our business, let's say layer classes, will be much more understandable, right? But in that case, we will need to make sure that we have appropriate naming, and when we will just take a look into the name of the function that this is invoked, it will be necessary for us to go and take a look what is actually inside of that function. So next good item for us to include at the beginning of the project, and it's kind of, let's say, a framework that could be included everywhere when it's necessary. It's a possibility for us to use logger class, or for example logger object. And the idea behind it is in the following. So when something crashes in our code, what we will be able to do is we will be able to actually log into that object the actual error. And in that case, if that object will be visible for our system administrators, so that means that they will be able to review, fix that issue in next, for example, iteration. And in that case, we will be able to see that it was not actually missed. So for that, what we could use as an example, it's imagine that we have an API integration and someone call our platform, and for some reason sometimes the calls fail. Or for example, we invoking callouts to external system, and sometimes we could see bad responses, right? And for example, for synchronization of the data, we're expecting that everything will be synchronized. But only with this logger object, we will be able to see that some records are actually not synchronized, what was the actual issue with that, and system administrators will be able to handle it. So it's another situation. Because we just touched API logic and any kind of integrations, usually in integration what we are doing is we are implementing kind of retry technique. So what does it mean? So let's imagine what we need to do is we need to synchronize Salesforce database with some external database, like for example website. And in that case, what we expect is we expect that that specific website always will have the same data that we have in Salesforce. So in that case, what we could do is on the actual object record in Salesforce, when it's actually changed, we could have a flag like, for example, awaiting synchronization or latest synchronization time. And each time when this record is updated and one of the key fields is updated, what we could do is we could actually run our logic for synchronization. But sometimes, for example, let's imagine that external website is down, or for example, it was not able to proceed with its record. So we need to have an identifier that will help us to quickly find out what is happening. So logger object will help us, but in addition to that, what we could do is we could actually play with the checkbox on the actual record, and when the actual transaction is not yet done, when the object is not yet synchronized, so in that case the checkbox will still be equal to false. So it's not yet done. So in that manner, to be able to review the quality of data, what is possible, then we'll be able for system administrators to do is to actually create reports. It's, let's say, another technique that we could think of for us to be able to find out all of kind of bad data, let's say. So that means that, like when we're preparing reports, so not all of the reports should just cover that part of visualization of the, let's say, correct data where everything is okay. We could have a logic that will allow us to quickly find out issues with our data. So it's another, let's say, good habit of analysts on the project, to be able to quickly find out if there are any gaps or if there are any kind of issues with the actual system. So I think that we are going a little bit too far right into each detail, and maybe we need to return back to our original topic. What should we do when we just starting development on the project? So in terms of the code, right, because we are mostly talking about the development, so we need to make sure that the quality of our code is, let's say, pretty good, and it have low-level issues. For that, it's always good for us to enforce CI jobs where we have automatic check on the code quality. So in terms of the code quality, at this moment we could use even on IDE level plugins for VS Code that allowing us to connect PMD. So PMD, it's actually a rule set that allowing us to track what kind of issues in terms of Apex code we have in our project. Like, for example, it could check where we have is too long parameter list in our function, where we have it's too big, let's say, cyclomatic of our code, where we don't have appropriate comments added, where we have unit tests without asserts. So it shows for us different bunch of stuff, and those different bunch of stuff we could actually configure with a special rule set. And the special rule set could be optimized for each kind of project. But you see the main point that I would like to bring, that it's if every developer on their project during their development will include that plugin into their IDEs. So what the plugin will allow to do in that case, it will allow on earlier stages for developers to identify what is their kind of issues. Plus, in addition to that, PMD allowing us to see security issues. Like, for example, if we will enable that specific rule set,